All right, I am here to talk to you about one of the most interesting philosophers I've ever read, and certainly one of the most provocative, intriguing accounts of freedom that I think you'll ever consider. It's a radical form of freedom. So, Jean-Paul Sartre was a French philosopher, and in the early 20th century, and he was a very famous philosopher. He's probably one of the most well-known philosophers in terms of pop culture, right up there with Nietzsche and things like that. Anyway, he was a champion. He was a fierce defender. At least early in his career. Later in his career it becomes more complicated, but we're just going to consider the early Sartre at this point. Early in his career, he was very much an advocate for a radical form of freedom. He believed that we are absolutely free. And by the same token, he was very much an ardent, passionate critic of determinism. He did not believe deterministic theories of actions were right. So determinism essentially means that our life is caused, or decisions are produced by forces outside of our control, that we don't have free will, that is an illusion, that nothing we could do could have been done otherwise. We are determined to act in a particular way. Okay, so you've got that kind of vision, a very kind of materialistic scientific position, and you've got Sartre on the scene who's saying, no, that is completely wrong. We are radically free. Okay, and that radical freedom consists in our consciousness. So it is a conscious form of freedom. And Sartre is very good in terms of bringing up examples to illustrate his point. And so we'll start with his vertigo example. And he thinks that the vertigo example, and vertigo means really a fear of falling, it's kind of a nausea, it's a dizziness when you're up high. And you get that, or many people get that sensation, and they think, well, this is just my fear of falling, I'm terrified, I can't help it. But Sartre thinks that experience actually points to something much more profound. And he essentially says, if you're up high and you've got this sensation of vertigo, this fear of falling, it's not that you're afraid of falling, it's that you're afraid of throwing yourself off a cliff or off the height. What you fear is not that you might accidentally fall, or that something may shake the ledge that you're on. What you fear is that you are going to make a decision to jump and to end your life. And you fear that, you're anxious about that. That's what the vertigo is. You're anxious about it, not in the sense that you're actually going to do it, but in the sense that experience of being on the edge, having the possibility of falling, awakens your freedom. You recognize in that instant that you have the power, if you so choose, to make a radical decision. You have the power to end your life. And what is worrisome, or what is anxious about that, is that we don't want to feel like we have that absolute control, that we could end it all in an instant. Think about it, sometimes if you're driving, you can be driving along in a 2-lane road, there's no barrier in between. You could, when another car is coming towards you, just veer in front of that car and, cause a great crash, harm yourself, maybe even kill yourself and the other driver. And you have the freedom to do that. And if you feel uneasy when you're on the road in that situation, the uneasiness, the anxiety, is this recognition at some level of your consciousness that you have this radical, absolute freedom. And so for Sartre, what freedom consists in is the ability to create our own meanings and values. The ability to assign what events in life are meaningful or valuable to us. We have absolute freedom in that regard. We can choose completely what is important and what is not important to us. And by that same token, choose completely what influences us and what does not influence us. And so in that ridge example, or that fear of falling example, somebody might come back and say, well, I just can't do it. I've got a wife, I've got kids, I've got good friends, I've got to finish up my college degree, I've got a girlfriend or boyfriend, I've got a dog that I've got to care for, I've got bills that I've got to pay. You could list a million reasons as to why you wouldn't throw yourself off that cliff, why you wouldn't end your life. But those influences are only influences on us because we choose to make them, according to Sartre, an influence. We choose to place value on them. So it's only because I choose to value, for example, my wife and kids, that I will refuse or I will refrain from jumping. If I didn't value them, well, then that wouldn't be an influence on me. That wouldn't stop me. Betraying friends or letting down friends. That only matters if I value the opinions and feelings of those friends. And so the radical form of freedom here, again, is the ability to completely and utterly and absolutely determine what is meaningful and what is not meaningful to us. And he gives another example. I talk about another example in the written version of this reading. And he talks about an alarm clock. So the alarm clock goes off. And it goes off, maybe every morning for you. And that alarm has a certain power. It has a certain pull. It seems to carry the message that you must get up. Now, of course, you might be able to snooze it a couple times, and that's probably already planned into your wake-up routine. But at a certain point, that alarm, or that sense that you must get up, becomes powerful. And why is that powerful? Why does that call us out of bed in the morning? Well, for Sartre, you have to kind of do a forensic analysis. You've got to kind of analyze, okay, what is it that is important for me to get up and do? Because only if there are things that are important for me to get up and do, does that alarm have meaning and does that alarm have power? If there was nothing for me to get up and do, that alarm would be meaningless. It would just be simply an annoyance. You could turn it off. You could unplug it. So what gives it meaning? Well, you might say, well, I've got to wake up to go to school. Well, why do you have to wake up to get to school? Well, you might say it's because I want good grades. Why do you want good grades? Well, maybe it's because you have an image of yourself as a good student, or maybe it's because you say, I want to get into graduate school, or I want to get a job. And goes on and says, okay, well, why do you want a job? Why do you want to go to graduate school? Maybe you say, well, it's because I want to have sufficient amount of money, or I want to have a certain social position. Okay, why do you want to have that amount of money? Why do you want to have that social position? And you say, well, it's to take care of the basic needs of life, or it's to satisfy my basic desires. Okay, well, why do those needs of life become important to you? And then Sartre says, well, and eventually, if you keep going back further and further, you come to a basic primary decision. And that basic primary decision is to choose whether or not life has a value for you, whether or not survival is meaningful to you. If survival is meaningful to you, then you've got to do the certain things that you need to do to survive. You have to, at the very basic, most minimal level, eat and drink, sleep, have some kind of shelter if you live in a harsh climate, some kind of clothing. But if survival doesn't mean anything to you, those needs are unimportant, and you don't have to do anything to fulfill those needs. So if you make a basic desire to survive, other things become important. But then you also have to make a decision, okay, in what manner does it matter to me to survive? Do I need to survive in a way that I'm materially comfortable? Do I need to survive in a way where I am recognized, where I'm an important part of society? If you answer yes to any of those things, then other things thereby become important. If you want to have a decent salary, for example, you've got to do those things that produce a decent salary. You got to go to work on time. You've got to be diligent. Most likely you'll have to go to school, perhaps college. And so all those things become important, become meaningful, and produce an urgency, only if we make the decision that would grant those things meaning and importance in relationship to whatever goal we're pursuing. Okay, again, most important thing to remember is that we choose the values that influence us. And Sartre rejects determinism because determinism essentially says our actions are caused. Sartre says we generate our causes. We generate our influence. We generate our motivations. But then you get to the question, okay, Sartre does recommend or does advocate for this radical form of conscious freedom. But are we absolutely free in a kind of unqualified general sense? Well, Sartre's not going to say yes to that. Because not everything about life is a choice. For example, I didn't grow up in Russia. I don't know how to speak Russian. Now I could learn Russian, but I'd always have some form of accent. And linguists have studied this. If you don't grow up in a language, you might get extraordinarily good at it, but you'll never master completely the language. But let's take an even more clear example. I don't know what, 5'10", 5'11". I won't ever be able to dunk a basketball. I could go to the gym 7 days a week. I could practice continuously. I could, build up my muscles. I'm never going to be able to dunk that basketball. And if you disagree with me and say, well, yeah, you could, if you just tried hard enough. Let's say the rim is 20 feet, and I'm not aided by a trampoline or anything. No one then could dunk a basketball, and certainly not me. And so there's certain physical limitations that we carry with us. Someone who is mentally disabled is not going to be able to, read Einstein, for example, depending upon the nature of the mental disability. But so then you say, okay, well, then, Sartre, that proves that you're wrong. You are not absolutely free. Well, Sartre comes back and he says, look, we choose the limitations that matter to us. So while it is true that I will never be able to dunk a basketball on a regulation-sized basketball net, that only becomes a limitation to me. That only becomes a barrier to me. That only becomes important to me if I choose to make dunking a basketball important. If not, it is in a certain sense meaningless. Like, I don't care about it. And if I don't care about dunking the basketball, then my physical limitations are in a certain sense not a barrier, not an obstacle. If I live, as another example, let's say we build a border wall with Mexico. That wall only becomes a limitation, only becomes a barrier if I want to get to the other side, whether it be from the USA to Mexico, or from Mexico to the US. Only when I desire something whereby that barrier becomes an obstacle to that desire am I limited, am I challenged. But again, Sartre is trying to say we choose what it is that limits us. We choose what it is that is an obstacle. And he takes this idea of radical, absolute, conscious freedom to emotions as well. He says, look, in a certain sense, our emotions are a product of what we value. But again, what we value is a product of what we freely choose to value. And so in the reading, I give the example of a grade. Let's say you get a bad grade. Well, you could react emotionally in a very great variety of ways. You could get angry, you could become indifferent, you could become depressed, you could even be happy. And if you're depressed, it might be because you say, look, there's nothing that I could do. I've done all I can. And what that depression indicates is a choice for Sartre that you are giving up, that you've chosen that path. You've chosen to respond to the bad grade in a way that says, I am incapable. Maybe your anger, if you choose that route, is a product of choosing to view the situation as one in which it isn't your fault that you got the bad grade. It's an injustice. The professor was bad, the test, was wrong, so on and so forth. You're choosing to view the event in a way that produces the angry reaction. If you're indifferent, you might say, well, I don't really care about this anyway. And if you're happy, you might say, well, that proves that I was never meant to be good in this subject. So you've got this radical freedom. And why then don't we recognize it? Why don't we all acknowledge this radical freedom? And Sartre goes to this concept of bad faith. And bad faith is a really fascinating, important concept, not only in Sartre, but in all of existential philosophy. And bad faith is essentially us pretending to be something other than we are. In Sartre's case, it's pretending that we are not free. Why would we do that? We hide our freedom from ourselves. Why would we hide our freedom from ourselves? Why would we not embrace this radical freedom where we get to choose our values completely? Well, Sartre said that freedom can be terrifying. I mean, think about the vertigo example. The ability to throw yourself off a high place is terrifying. It's scary that we would have that kind of power. And so many of us, most of us, try to hide that from ourselves. We try to pretend like we don't have that freedom. And he gives a couple of very, excellent examples. And one is the good Christian housewife. And so in this story, the good Christian housewife is, sitting there on a windowsill and she's looking at the people passing below. And she suddenly starts to get uneasy. She has this kind of anxiety. And what is this anxiety produced by? Well, for Sartre, she kind of starts to recognize that I could go outside, I could bring in one of these guys that's walking by, and I could sleep with them. And what is uneasy about that is the notion that she is not, in her essence, fundamentally, a good Christian housewife. She is playing one. And what is worrisome, what is troubling, what produces the anxiety, is that she recognizes at some level that this is a role that she's playing, but it's not a role that she has to continue to play. If she wants to go out there and just sleep with some of the guys passing by, she could do that. She could give up her role as a good Christian housewife and become just someone who sleeps around. And that recognition is what is producing the anxiety. That she recognizes, look, this is just something I'm choosing to play. This role, this identity, if I don't choose to play it anymore, if I don't choose to place value on it, I could go in a completely different direction. Sartre says much the same with a cafe waiter. He says, look at this guy, this waiter, pretending to be the waiter, walking around, serving people, acting in the way that waiters do. It's a role that he's playing. It's a game that he's playing. But he doesn't want to admit it. Because to admit it would be to admit to this radical freedom. Think about, perhaps how you view yourself as a student. Let's say you view yourself as a good student. And you identify with that role. Then you do what good students do. You come to class, you turn in assignments on time, you go to the professor for extra help, you do the reading, you work hard, you ask questions when you don't have an answer or an understanding of the material. You do all these things that good students do. But you're not a fundamentally good student. That's not who you are in your essence. That is who you are choosing to be. And you could choose differently. You could choose to value the identity of bad students and then go in a radically different direction. You could then start doing the things that bad students do. And that, again, is our freedom for Sartre isn't our ability to do, but to choose value and meaning. Because there are certain limitations in terms of what we're allowed or able to do. Go back to the dunking of the basketball example. But the value that we place on certain things will produce different courses of action. And that's what Sartre is getting at. That radical freedom. And we like to play the role because it gives us comfort. It'd be great to be a good student, or to be a good teacher, or to be a good nurse, or to be a good criminal justice professional. Because if you were really deep down those things, then in a certain sense you don't have to worry. You simply do what those kind of people with those identities do. You don't have the anxiety of, do I continue to act this way? Do I continue to play this role? No, you simply say, I am this role. This is who I am. If you ever said, this is who I am, Sartre would say that is a fundamental act of bad faith. You are not anyone. You are someone who chooses a role continuously and constantly throughout your entire life. The person that says, this is who I am, really should be saying, this is who I'm choosing to be at this moment. This is the role that I'm choosing to adopt. But we don't like to say that because, again, it gives us more comfort. It gives us more security. It gives us more direction if we identify ourselves with this role that we really are not. But that's bad faith for Sartre. And that's what he wants to kind of awaken our consciousness and bring to our attention. All right, so that is, kind of a broad overview of Sartre's radical form of freedom. It is fascinating. It is interesting. And that's the deal.